Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us today at this Global Policy Dialogue, Strengthening and Scaling Up Inclusive Digital Services, hosted by the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, also known as UN DESA. My name is Sammy Allen. I'm your host and moderator for today's event, and it is my pleasure to be with you for the next 90 minutes to guide this discussion on digital governance. How we can provide people with access to the digital tools needed for meaningful connectivity to public goods, services, and opportunities. We can use all the good ideas we learn and share today as we try as a society to get back on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Today's event is made possible by the support of the UN Peace and Development Trust Fund, and coming up during this dynamic interactive dialogue, we're going to take a closer look at the United Nations e-Government Survey 2022, just released yesterday. This survey provides a comprehensive assessment of the digital government landscape across all 193 member states of the UN. Our colleagues are popping the link to this report in the chat now, so you can check it out easily. And when I say easily, it is 219 pages. So make sure you check that out after this session. This edition of the survey includes data analysis in global and regional contexts and a study of local e-government development. It also highlights the critical need for inclusion in the hybrid digital society in order to leave no one behind. But first, before we continue, here are some practical tips and housekeeping for today's session. Now, we have English captions available in Zoom and Facebook by clicking on the captioning icon, which is on the bottom of your screens. Live captions are also available in the UN's 6 official languages: Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish, on a separate website with a case-sensitive link. So just select the access from where you want to see on the drop-down menu. You'll see this on your screens. It's bit.ly/captions29SEPT. This link is also written in the frame of the screen on the bottom. You will also be seeing that this event is being provided in American Sign Language too. So a great big hi and a big shout out to Laura and Daniel. Thank you for your support today. Now, we really do encourage you to spread the word on what you hear today on social media. So please use our hashtag, which is #FutureOfTheWorld. That's #FutureOfTheWorld. And you need that now because to view our polls and ask your questions, you're going to be using our interactive Slido tool. Now, if you can scan the QR code on the screen, or if you prefer, simply log on to Slido, slido.com, and insert the event code Future of the World, all one word, as the code. This is displayed on the bottom right of your screen. Get that ready now, because we want you to join the discussion by sending in your questions and have a look at the questions we already have. And if there's something that you would like me to ask our panelists, all you need to do is click on the thumbs up icon, and that will vote up that question for me to be able to speak to our panelists about. And remember, there is never such a thing as a silly question here in these forums. That's our housekeeping done, and I'd like to begin now with a poll on Slido and get your views on the big topic of today. So hopefully you all have that on your mobile devices or on your computer, and our poll will be launched now. The question is to you: what do you think is the biggest benefit of digital government services? I'll repeat that. What do you think is the biggest benefit of digital government services? Is it improved access to information? Is it increased civic engagement? Is it enhanced responsive services with efficiency? Maybe it's increased transparency and accountability, or perhaps you think it's something else. If you can pop your vote into Slido now, we'll keep that poll open for a few minutes. It is now time to introduce a very special guest to kick off our conversations today. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to Christophe Joubert, High Representative of the Prime Minister for European Digital Policy and member of the United Nations Internet Governments Forum Leadership Panel, Republic of Poland. Dzień dobry I witam. We are delighted to have you here, sir, and I hand the floor to you for introductory remarks.
Dzień dobry, Helen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really very pleased to join you today and this very special United Nations event on strengthening and scaling up the inclusive digital services. I will start with a bit of the history. As you may remember, last December, Poland was the proud host of the United Nations Internet Governance Forum, the global multi-stakeholder platform we all know very well. At that time, the 16th IGF provided a fully hybrid format for over 300 sessions that were held. We had a record number of almost 10,400 registered participants from 175 countries in all continents. So we were joined by nearly 200 ministers, parliamentarians, other high-level leaders from the private sector, civil society, the technical community, and others. So looking back now, I'm really proud that we made it possible for numerous policymakers, entrepreneurs, representatives of academia and non-governmental organizations, youth, and thousands of people from all over the world to meet and to debate the opportunities and challenges posed by the internet. We encourage organizing stakeholders to try to refer in their sessions to the most pressing global issues mentioned in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, especially Sustainable Development Goal number 7, expressing the need for building resilient infrastructure, promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization and fostering innovation, which is very close to my heart, a positive vision for the future of digital services, e-government, and the internet itself must combine always fundamental values such as human rights, access and openness, as well as economic considerations. It's just one of the conclusions included in the so-called Katowice IGF messages, a final document issued just after the forum. In the context of universal access to the internet, the main consideration is to ensure sustainable internet access for all of the people in the world. According to the International Telecommunication Union, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of internet users increased from 4.1 billion in 2019 to 4.9 billion in 2021, but still 2.9 billion people, 96% of whom live in developing countries, mostly women, are still without internet access and at a high risk of falling behind in the digital revolution. Only by improving connectivity and bringing stakeholders together on this issue, we will be able to achieve the sustainable development goals and reduce barriers. Ensuring that all the people have mindful access to the internet, in my opinion, is a global priority those days. On the other hand, through stakeholders, we need to reflect how people will be able to use the connectivity once they get the access. We must look for a common ground and focus on strategic and vertical activities like building or complementary matrix actions based on issues related to strategic and vertical directions. At the IGF in Poland, as a strategic directions, we recognize infrastructure and connectivity, e-services and open goods and skills, the competences and inclusion, cybersecurity and digital trust. And from the very vertical perspective, international cooperation, very important those days, and investment and funds, which is always something we will need. The latest UN e-government survey 2022 also provides vital data, analysis, and recommendations to support our work, ensuring that no one is left offline. Back to IGF and Katowice protocol, Katowice IGF messages, I used personally every occasion to bring the IGF messages to the attention of decision makers at international fora, as the IGF outcomes and decisions and directions are essential within other global initiatives like United Nations Secretary General's Our Common Agenda, Roadmap for Digital Cooperation, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, or the Digital Strategy 22-25. All these are to support countries and communities to use digital technology to drive down already mentioned inequality, help inclusivity, tackle climate change, and open up economic opportunities. In my opinion, governments should take the lead and encourage national stakeholders and external partners, including international development agencies, to design, implement, and monitor joint development strategies and e-services. Affordable, universal, meaningful connectivity is the key to create a human-centric technology. Secretary General Ropman underscores the use of open source technologies and digital public goods as the means to create the developed digital infrastructure for the benefit of people worldwide. From that perspective, I also see very important role to be played here by the IGF leadership panel recently appointed by the United Nations Secretary General. It shall not only provide strategic inputs, support high-level and stakeholder engagements, but also exchange IGF outputs with other relevant fora and facilitate the input of these fora to the IGF's agenda. Having received the honor of being a member of the panel, I will do every effort to bring messages from the IGF to relevant decision makers. The Secretary General will certainly engage the panel and underline its importance to the global digital dialogue, as it consists of the key individuals representing all stakeholders groups, as well as the technology envoy, multi-stakeholder advisory group chair, and annual IGF host countries. With this opening remark, I will stop here and let you explore further the discussion and strengthening and scaling up inclusive digital services. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Christoph, for sharing that. That really puts some context into our conversation, and also, if I may say, some motive to have these really meaningful dialogues. So thank you so much for welcoming and giving that context.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is time to look at those poll results. Thank you for those who have been putting their votes in. Please remember to go to slido.com to join the conversation with the event code Future of the World. So I asked the question, what do you think is the biggest benefit of digital government services? Improved access to information, increased civic engagement, enhanced responsive services with efficiency, increased transparency and accountability, or something else? And having a look at the current poll, I can see that in the lead, very much so, is enhanced responsive services with efficiency. So I will be making sure that our panel have that. Second biggest benefit is improved access to information, according to our audience. Third is increased transparency and accountability with 22%. It's almost the same, actually, as improved access to information. Increased civic engagement comes in, and then something else, which is always a joy to try and discover, comes in last. So we'll be discussing that. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining in that poll. Do keep Slido here because we'll be using it again shortly. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists for Building an Inclusive Digital Society, Trends and Developments. Our first set of experts will be sharing with us some of the key findings of the e-government survey and other insights from their work in their regions. Of course, as we work towards making the SDGs our reality, it is important to measure our progress and hold ourselves accountable, and this includes all matters of digital governance. But before I introduce our incredible panel, I am going to take the temperature of the room again with another poll just to make sure you are ready. And whilst you're voting, I will introduce our panelists. I would like this time to know your views on what is your biggest concern about growing digital government services. What's keeping you awake at night? What is your biggest concern? Is it people being left behind? Is it privacy? Is it security? Is it that automation is impersonal? Or is it something else that's concerning you? Please let me know. And while you're voting, I shall introduce our speakers for this panel. It's great to have you all with us. Great big welcome. We have Vincenzo Acquaro. Vincenzo is the Chief of the Digital Government Branch in the Division for Public Institutions and Digital Government at UN DESA and is head of the e-government survey team. So we're delighted to have you with us, Vincenzo. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. This very interesting meeting.
We've got lots to talk about, I'm sure. It's great to see that we have Ambassador Nella Liosk, the Ambassador at Large for Digital Affairs for Estonia. A great big welcome to you, Nella.
Hello, everybody from Tallinn. Good evening.
Good to see you. And last but very not least, we have Mr. David Suter. He is the Managing Director of ICT Development Associates and someone who brings more than 25 years of experience working with various UN agencies on digital issues. David, thank you so much for finding the time today to be joining us.
That's my pleasure. Hello, everyone.
We do have to make sure that we know David does have empty bookshelves because he's actually moving house this afternoon, and it's a real privilege and an honor to have you with us, sir. So just so that everybody knows, there were books in there a few hours ago. So back to our poll before I ask some questions. Let's reveal your concerns about growing digital government services. Let's see what the biggest concern is. Coming in at the moment, and thank you for your votes, very much front and center is people being left behind, which was actually what Christophe Schubert was alluding to, and I'm sure we'll be discussing this in some detail this afternoon. Second to this is security, followed by privacy, and then automation is impersonal is coming at the back end of that. So our panel, I hope you've got that, and I can share that with you as we go through. So Vincenzo, let's start with you. We must do that. We've got to condense 219 pages of information and survey results. As the lead author of this report, can you share some of the key findings with us, please, sir?
Thank you very much. And I will try to be in the 2 minutes that you recommended, but we will then go through the discussion more in depth. But first, let me just say, I do believe that David put all the books in digital. That's why the shelter is empty. Anyway, going on the e-government survey, as you said, yes, we just launched. It's really fresh from oven, and I want to just give you some highlights, going through the flow of the chapters of the survey, because we have 5 key chapters. The first one is about the global ranking and global trends. So the key message from this: the world is really moving faster on digital. So this is a very good sign. We have an improvement overall for what we have, our indicator. That is the e-government development index. This is a composite indicator, just is based on the 3 subcomponents: online service index, telecommunication infrastructure index, and human capital index. And based on that, the overall average, the world average, is growing, but is growing smoothly. We expected to see more improvement worldwide, but at the end we realized that that didn't happen, and we do believe that this is because many countries were really struggling with the COVID pandemic, and they were, while when we moved through the pandemic, governments were really moving faster on digital issues, but some of them, they were just managing the priorities and the emergencies. So only the countries that had put in place a more strategic digital transformation and digital reform, they were really able to improve from this kind of situation. So this is the first, and the reason why I'm saying this is because we will see that many countries from LDC, so least developed countries and developing states, they were the ones that were suffering the most. They were really improved so much. So the key message is that worldwide the world is moving on even more from and even more on the whole of government approach and really on all of societies. At regional level, we have Europe that's still leading. Then we have Asia and Americas. Americas is North and Latin American. Then we have Oceania. Oceania is driven by New Zealand and Australia that are really really strong, but the islands in the Pacific, they are really not going so well. They are suffering. And then last, we have Africa that is really lagging behind. So these are the key messages that comes from the two chapters on our measurement based on our e-government survey. We will also have, and this is for the first time, we assess all the municipalities, 193 municipalities for each member state. And this is something that we have been doing since 2018 in partnership with the United Nations University eGov. And I'm very happy to see that our friend and colleague Delfina is here today. So maybe she can spend more word on that. And then we have the other chapters leaving the one behind. I would leave to you, I think, for the further discussion, the other chapters, so we can, you know, create more interaction with the other panelists. So for me, I will stop now. I took even too much time.
Thank you, Vincenzo. That was a very nice, concise way of giving us some really core highlights and things that you were quite surprised to hear. And as you said, I'm sure we'll be discussing this. And as you mentioned, we have Delfina from the university joining us in the next panel. But back to our panel now. Nella, what are some of the trends that you've been seeing, you know, as this is what our core topic is about? So what are the trends in digital governments you're seeing in Estonia?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. And I would also like to thank Vincenzo and the great team of UN DESA for keeping us tense for 2 years and putting a lot of pressure to maintain actually what we have achieved here in Estonia and also globally, because it is indeed more and more challenging, as the index results also show that the progress is not as fast. And of course, Estonia is happy to be leading the online service index, but we have quite a bit catching up to do with connectivity, actually something that was mentioned by our opening speech also. But when we look at the trends, I believe the course that we have set here in Estonia, let's say the end of 2000s, when we started to move towards live event-based services, I believe that this is an increasing trend still, because more and more governments, more and more private organizations are, let's say, collecting and also willing to share data, despite all those potential risks and concerns that both the public and the public sector also has. Because for live event-based services, a lot of organizations are involved, Of course, the countries that have, let's say, a simple government structure or political structure, such as Estonia, perhaps it is easier. Still, there is a challenge around getting central and local municipalities work together. That is also needed for life event-based services. So our first service was around the birth, and it has been also increasing over time. I think the other one is related to the invisibility of the government. And I think this is also relates to why we do digitalization. We don't want to take a lot of time from our people and also companies. We want their life to be simple and easy, that they can communicate with the government if they want to and when they want to, but as little as possible. So this is probably the second trend that will continue, especially in these countries that have put in place clear mechanisms for data collection, maintenance, and also sharing. And I believe the third trend, and if I'm taking too much time, then just let me know. But I think the third trend is actually more related to the administrative processes that support the service provisioning. And this is related to an increased use, again, data and artificial intelligence. So this we see here in Estonia that more and more public administrations are turning for AI to optimize their own processes. Some simple examples are detecting, let's say, private data from, let's say, some documents or court decisions that need to be public, but without the private data. So this is all being more and more automated. And ultimately, it should, of course, also improve the service provisioning for the people. And the last one, and I will stop after that here to have a nice conversation, is related also to something that Christoph was mentioning, and this is related to digital public goods. So we see quite a bit of an increase in reuse of different components that the different government organizations may need. And this is related, on the one hand, to similar needs and similar, let's say, problems and similar solutions to these problems, but on the other hand, to this challenge of the lack of talent and human resources. So we see this collaboration nationally, but also more and more globally, that the governments or government organizations pool their human resources together to develop certain open source reusable components, and then they apply it again across the governments, but also across borders. And I believe that this is probably something that we will see more and more in the future, and not only in small countries like Estonia. So
thank you, Ella. I think that's really nice to pull out four sort of trends that were, not just, inclusive to Estonia, but across the globe. Thank you. David, you have a huge amount of experience as well with policies to correct digital inequality. As we've already heard, these trends are coming out in this report. Can you share what you believe are the trends and developments in digital governance and inclusion with us?
Surely. Firstly, thank you, Vincenzo, and your team for a really interesting report, which I spent time reading yesterday when I should have been packing books and so on. I tend to look at this as I look at this as an analyst, not as a practitioner, and because of that, I suppose I'm generally most concerned with the challenges rather than with what's working well. That's what I look at. So I think the main trends are clear enough, and they come out in the report, and there's steady progress, I think is probably the word one would use, towards digitalization of public services, as there is in other spheres of life. I think two things from the report I bring out, which Vincenzo mentioned. So firstly, that it's affected by non-digital factors. So the pace of digital development is affected significantly by the pandemic, but in both directions, an iterative process, in some ways beneficial, in other ways not. We're at the moment at significant risk of global recession, which would also have a substantial effect on the pace of digital development and e-government. And the other is to stress the public policy inputs, the importance of those. In the study that I led for UNCTAD with the regional commissions on the impact of COVID on e-commerce, it was very clear that public policy interventions had a positive or negative impact. So briefly, I think 4 things I think are worth analysing. Firstly, that not surprisingly change is faster in some countries than in others, for some individuals than in others. There's a tendency, therefore, to increase inequality. And that growing inequality is a trend which we also need to analyse. So I think that there's an important area there. The second is that we should be looking at impacts here. So we should be looking firstly at the reasons why there are differences between different countries, the experience of different countries and the priorities of different countries, disaggregating that, but also at the consequential changes that result from the way in which digital public services are deployed and implemented and used. So what is happening to the way in which society works, the way in which economies work, the way in which businesses make decisions. So that impact is the second area of analysis. There are clearly big changes there, and I think we don't know as much as we need to about them. And the third is actually about the relationship between government and e-government. So the report refers to it being increasingly difficult to differentiate these. I think there's an underlying issue here which is important to recognize, which is that digitalization does not make bad government into good government. Whether we're talking in terms of efficiency or inclusion or respect for human rights or whatever it might be, digitalization of public services can and should be inclusive, more inclusive, but it can also lead to discrimination and disadvantage and to the exacerbation of existing disadvantage. And different governments have different problems, different priorities, different populations. The impact of what they do in how they implement digitalization of public services has significant results for that sort of relationship between the citizen and the state. So whether e-government works for the benefit of government, making it cheaper and more efficient, for example, or for the benefit of citizens, making it more effective and accountable. So that's, I think, the third area that I'd say we need to analyze the trends of what is going on. There's a slightly different perspective, perhaps, from what you...
But that's the perspective we need. And moving into our second panel, we're going to be looking at, that in a little bit more depth, and challenges. We need to recognise those challenges in order to also create those solutions. David, you were mentioning about COVID, because it would be remiss of us to not, in terms of the shifts and the trends, and that this report is also showing us. And you alluded to this, but how has, in other ways, COVID interrupted digital services? And is there, and I'm going to ask you all after picking on David first, and has there been some positive, rather than the challenges, but have there also been positive improvements that COVID perhaps has kick-started?
I think there was a sense at the beginning of the pandemic that we thought this is going to really accelerate the digitalization of many things. And to a considerable extent, that did happen. In the particular study that I worked on with UNCTAD, but I also did work on human rights implications with a number of African bodies. I think what you could see is that the capacity to deliver that digitalization varied enormously from place to place. And it's one of the reasons why COVID has exacerbated the growth of inequalities, which was already there as a sort of latent within the digitalization process. Undoubtedly, though, it did make a very big difference. And the first difference was to do with resilience. It was possible for governments, businesses, citizens who had access to digital resources to maintain their activity in a way that would not otherwise have been possible. So that resilience was really important, and it also did accelerate. We learned lessons from it. lessons about what works, lessons about what was most necessary, what was priority in order to achieve other things, lessons about what didn't work as well. So all of that was really kind of important and positive. But I think it did emphasize the scale of inequality of capabilities, and also the importance of the public policy response, which needs to be coherent and evidence-based. One last thing, though, I'm not certain how lasting all of those impacts are, because I think there's a sort of return in many people's minds wanting to go back to how things used to be before this really traumatic experience. And seeing my grandchildren is better in person than on Zoom, and people like to go shopping, and people like human interaction, including in public services. So I think an effective digital strategy has to respond to that, and there are good lessons there we can learn from COVID too.
I'd like to take that to Nella. There's good lessons that we can learn, and we understand COVID has disrupted, and I'm sure in Estonia that's been exactly the case. But in terms of those trends, would you agree with David? Are there any other sort of positive improvements that you may have seen?
Thank you. I have to agree with David actually on many things here, because I think the biggest lesson from COVID is that it was a test for us, and really a test for us to see where things work, where they do not actually work. For example, when we look at education, Estonia had in place infrastructure for distance learning, and also for the communication with school and parents. And the communication side was a lot more used before for COVID than actually the distance learning side. And then suddenly we were forced to really test that distance learning. And what we saw was actually that it's perhaps not the way to go, or at least not yet. Several kids dropped out of school, especially those that perhaps needed more assistance than those that were doing anyway well in school. And this is just one of the examples, but many things I believe did kick off, even and they have stayed. Even very simple things like organizing meetings or seminars and discussions like the one that we are having today. We would not do that before COVID. We would still like to find a way to meet, but now we know what we can do and what we can discuss virtually. And I am glad to connect to all of you here, and what we cannot do. But one thing I would like to also perhaps emphasize is that the COVID also, in a way, shows that we are rather similar in many ways. And that kickstarted, I would say, or reawakened the trend of reuse, because even COVID applications were rather similar across countries and could have been actually replicated. And of course localized and put to work in a local context and integrated with the local processes and all that. But it shows that several of our problems were actually similar, and the solutions could also be.
And that's where collaboration and conversation steps in. Vincenzo, very quick, because I've got some questions from our audience that I would like to be tasking you all to answer. But was there anything that you saw in terms of positive improvements that COVID, other than what Nella and David have shared, that you've seen come through from the report?
Yes, we covered this area in our survey in different parts. So let's start with the positive issues, because I fully agree with David's analysis. Nella highlights really, and they reflect in the survey. But let me say that the good thing that we observe is first that public administration and public institutions really start working closer with the private sector, and there was a strong, from this point of view, private sector was really a booster public administration in order to provide the quick solutions to solve and to cover the emergency. And then we also did some, we also have a look at the different sector of the societies, and we can, and in the report, you will see that was an improvement in terms of services for social protection, of course, in the education, also healthcare, because this is really part of the emergency, and also in justice. So these are the key sectors that got improvement during the pandemic in terms of really online services providing to citizens. But really, from one side we look at these positive trends, but indeed, what David said is really important on the issue of inequalities. Yes. Because inside not only among the regions, but among countries, the issues that our society is not digital, is hybrid. And we still need to take in consideration all the kind of population we have, in particular the vulnerable groups. And sometimes, or even most of the time, when you start thinking on we used to say digital by design, but the reality is that we should be inclusive by design, and then we have to implement the services, because otherwise we will not be able to capture the most vulnerable groups that need it the most.
Well, Vincenzo, I'd like to bring in a question at that point and thank our audience for upvoting questions that are important to them. And so far, the most highlighted and upvoted question, Vincenzo, in the lines of this is, what about the future of indigenous culture and languages in this world? If all parties, all state parties and governments go to digital services, I say thank you to Peter, who's in Kenya, who is asking that question. Vincenzo, you can carry on with your point, I think, in terms of this. This is a challenge.
Yes, indeed. If I may, I would ask really if you can, they can show, I gave two slides, one slide, the second one, that is about digital divide, because this is really pertinent on the questions. And show immediately how the situation is in African region in terms of digital divide, in terms of because the first thing that we need to see is that first we need to put all the countries in a position to really to get access. And I'm not talking about only access when we said leaving no one offline, but also to give the accessibility and the affordability of the services. Otherwise, will be a big issue. At the same time, as I said before, while the future, and we covered this in the report, is more in the direction Nele also said about invisible government, about the seamless government, about the cognitive government, or predictive government. So we try to simplify the life of the citizens and to look more on what we call life cycle. So why we have to ask citizen issues that we can easily get directly from the system. At the same time, again, I go back to what I said before. We cannot assume that all people will be digital. It's really important to start thinking on solutions. I can tell you, some advanced countries that were trying to do everything, putting online, mobile phone, everything is online, they just start realizing that it's still important to have people that reach older people and go home and start working with them and show them how to use it, or even do the services for them. then new technology, use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, that will be very useful. But again, with but we need to really rethink the way the services need to be developed.
Yeah, and we'll move more forward into that with our friend Delfino in our next session about those best practices for advancing local and national governance. Vincenzo, actually interesting that you brought up AI. It's almost like you are mind reading the questions that I'm going to ask David, if he can give us his opinion on a question, again, really popular today. And if anybody else would also like to answer this question as well, please do. But starting with you, David, how do you see digital technologies, namely artificial intelligence and virtual reality, affecting public services? And thank you for that question, Kimberly Garth James over in the USA. David, to start with you.
Can I just make one comment on the marginalisation question?
Please
because I think it was raised in terms of Indigenous communities who exemplify one of the challenges here, which is it's relatively easy for digital public services to address the relatively vulnerable. It's much more difficult to address the most marginalised. And most marginalised are often experiencing a variety of different causes of vulnerability. So the intersectional analysis of that is really important. And I think that that reaching to the bottom 5% in terms of their current access to service is really critical. And one of the warnings I would have to governments, I see this in one or two governments, is that digitalization of public services is seen as a way of saving money rather than of extending access and services to all. So that aside, on AI, one of the challenges about artificial intelligence is that we don't know what it's going to be able to do. We fear much of what it might do, as well as having hopes for some of what it might do. And until we've got more experience, it is very difficult to assess. And then along with that is the problem to do with the pace of change, which is that the pace of change in AI technology is faster than the pace of change in government systems. So we, by the time we are in a position to know the answers to what we want to deploy it for, it may well already have led to situations that we would have, that are not what we would have sought to do with it. So I think that with AI, I think it is really important for policymakers to think jointly with technologists about what both opportunities and risks are. We don't ever achieve opportunities, realize opportunities, unless we also think about risks. And to do that in a way that is not about promoting the technology, but about promoting the services. So starting from what improvements, what changes in governance are desired by citizens and would make the quality of government better. And then moving on to that, rather than starting from the point of thinking about what the technology could do, if it were given free rein.
It's a big subject and not one that we could be discussing for 4 hours. With a minute to go at this part of the session, I'm going to task you all with the very difficult job to be super concise. I'm going to ask for one key suggestion from you for ensuring that we leave no one behind in digital governance. I'd like to start with you, Vincenzo. One key suggestion for not leaving anyone behind.
Yeah, is really listen to the people. Citizens need to be heard, and they need really to interact proactively with the government, but it's more the government that needed to listen and need to take decisions based also on the inputs provided by citizens and look at vulnerables. That's absolutely important.
Thank you. Listen, Vincenzo, I'm going to cross to Tallinn, to you, Nella. Your one key suggestion.
Thank you. I believe governments have to make sure that they provide everybody something useful and also easy and comfortable to use. But of course, backing up with the connectivity issue that was addressed at the beginning. It is becoming more and more difficult.
Thank you, Nella. So that's ensuring that we need to work hard at that. Lastly, David, one more suggestion for ensuring that we
I
need.
really said what Vincenzo said, that it's engagement and listening to people. But if you want me to add something else, I would say it is focusing on building trust amongst the people in the services you provide, because trust is hard to gain and easy to lose. And once it's lost, it's very difficult to recover.
Thank you all. I think that's a very nice way to close out this panel, this part of the session. Listen, be inclusive, build trust. Really nice 3 takeaways. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. Some of those questions you will get answered by reading and reviewing the report. It's there for you now. We'll be keeping that in the chat. Any questions we can keep in the dialogue, and I'm sure we'll get answered. But for this moment, what it leaves me to say is a huge thank you to our incredible panelists, David, to Nella, and to Vincenzo. Thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are already at part 2 of today's dialogue, which is around best practices for advancing local and national digital governance, which is what we were alluding to just now. This is a great opportunity to discuss stakeholder engagement and partnerships, how they're going to work in more detail. For those of you who might just be joining us, wherever you've been, please make sure you've got Slido ready, which is our audience interactive tool, and make sure that you've got slido.com with the event code Future of the World to make sure that we've got your questions in there and, of course, our polls. So I'd like to ask you, dear audience, another question. Make sure you're still with us, and our first poll for this session, so that we can start the minds of our panelists thinking. The question is, what do you think is the most important thing we need for improving digital services across the board, What do you believe, what do you think is the most important thing we need for improving digital services across the board? Is it more money? Is it more political will? More consultation and engagement, more technology and knowledge sharing, or is it something else we're not identifying? Whilst you are voting away on that question, let me introduce our guests. Great to have you all with us. The wonders of technology, it's magical that you popped up onto my screen. A great big welcome to Mike Bevan. Mike is the Senior Manager in the Digital Government Transformation Public Sector team of Amazon Web Services. Mike, great to have you with us today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Big welcome to you, Sir Anir Chowdhury, who is a policy advisor on all digital matters for the government of Bangladesh. Anir, it's wonderful for you joining us today. Good afternoon, good evening to you.
Thank you very much, Sammy. Great to be here. And the previous panel actually showed us some really interesting points. So glad to be part of this discussion.
I think we'll be taking a lot of those points and moving them into this best practices part of today's dialogue. And we were talking about you in the previous panel, Delfina. Please welcome onto screen Delfina Suarez, Head of the Operating Unit on Policy-Driven Electronic Governance for the UN University over in Portugal. Thank you so much for joining us, Delfina.
Thank you so much. Allow me just to say that it is a pleasure to be here and to greet all of the colleagues in the panel as well as all the audience.
Let's get to it, shall we? Let's see the poll results. Thank you so much for voting. What do you think is the most important thing we need for improving digital services across the board? Let's drum roll on the results. Really quite ahead, panelists, just so you know, 44%, few votes coming in now, more political will, which ties in with our discussion nicely. Second to that, and crawling up the numbers, is more technology and knowledge sharing. Thirdly, more consultation and engagement. interestingly, down towards the bottom was more money. So that's quite an interesting poll to be cracking on with. Amir, I'm going to start with you if you don't mind. I'd like to ask you first if you could share some examples of what Bangladesh is doing to improve local and national digital governance, and two questions in one. Can you share some of also the major challenges that you have in this work?
Sure. Thank you, Sami. Bangladesh had been on a very aggressive digital journey since the end of 2008, when our Prime Minister made a clarion call to build a digital Bangladesh, even in an impoverished country at that time. By 2021, which was the 50th anniversary of our country's birth. So very strong political will demonstrated. And as you pointed out, political will came up number one, and that was demonstrated in the work that we have done in the last 14 or 15 years. And that really paid dividends during COVID time period. We set up what are called digital centers, which are physical locations, about 9,000 across the entire country, half of them in government offices, but all run by entrepreneurs who sell services. So we started with birth registration being sold digitally. And then now we have over 300 different types of services from these centers. Every month, about 5 to 6 million people go to these centers to access digital services. So analog citizens accessing digital services. That's how we actually tried to bridge digital divide. And we saw in the last decade or so, we did a poll in December 2021, we saved citizens about 12 billion work days, about $16 billion, and about 7+ billion visits were eliminated. So this is how we measure the efficiency of how we are delivering benefits to citizens through TCV, time, costs, and visits. During COVID, we actually saw about 18 million decisions being taken electronically, even though all offices were closed for months and months. We saw social safety nets, garment workers' payments all done digitally. We saw merchant payments using mobile wallet go up about 15 times, so 1,500% increase. And judiciary, which was the last bastion to fall in terms of digital adoption, was also made digital because we had overcrowding in prisons because no bail hearing was taking place. So we reduced overcrowding in prisons by 11% within 2 months using virtual bail hearing. So these were all things that happened during COVID because of the infrastructure, because of the mechanisms, both digital and physical, that we had put in place. We also saw use of cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence being used quite predominantly during COVID for healthcare service delivery, for tracking the disease, because we had only one PCR lab in the country of 165 million people in the beginning. So we used technology to actually track the disease by having people call into our national helpline and using that data and analyzing using artificial intelligence. We saw huge growth of data dashboards in almost all departments. I think data, as we call it, the new oil, I think was really well understood by the policymakers during COVID. You also talked about challenges that we faced, and we saw two big challenges. Education was a big challenge. Even though we resorted to internet, we saw that most of our primary schoolers and high schoolers did not have access to internet in a meaningful way. So they may have access, but it was not reliable. It was not fast enough to actually see high quality videos during that time. So we resorted to repurposing our Parliament TV as education TV, and that broadened access. But still, we were not able to reach most of our students in a meaningful way. We also saw, I think a lot of our previous panelists talked about leaving no one behind. Even though we repurposed our national helpline 333 as the largest telemedicine service in the country, we saw over 7 million calls coming in to serve people for telemedicine. We saw 10 million calls for emergency food support. But still, we saw people not being able to use technology in an effective way. So this is one challenge that we have taken on. We are working on a report called Equality Through E-Quality, which is looking at very specifically, group by group, individual by individual, business by business, especially focusing on the small businesses, to see what would make them bring into the digital lifestyle and what would actually enhance their productivity, enhance their lifestyles using digital. So the digital adoption has to be really seen through the eyes of the beneficiary, eyes of the consumer.
It's interesting that you're actually saying what the last panel finished off with, that you're listening and building trust with the people, and that's, as you said, leading to that top of the tree political will. Amir, thank you for sharing some.
We see that a lot of expansion has happened for digital, a lot of adoption, but not enough inclusion. So there is a big difference now. We see, I think COVID really put it to, I think broadened our perspective and deepened our perspective, actually. That is not expansion that will help us, but inclusion. Thank you.
And it's probably highlighted that in a shorter space of time. So Amir, thank you so much for sharing. Plenty more to talk on that. Mike, I'm sure everybody in our audience is super keen to hear how AWS, Amazon Web Services, is working to improve digital governance. Can you share some of this with us?
Certainly, yeah. I'm going to come at this from a couple of perspectives, because before I joined Amazon Web Services, I was in fact a UK civil servant and was responsible for the UK's digital transformation programme. So I've kind of looked at this from both sides of the window, sort of thing, from being a civil servant trying to bring about change in how we deliver public services, through to then how, as technology organisations, do we support governmental organisations and therefore support citizens. And the kind of the event of the pandemic and COVID has been an interesting one, I think, certainly from our perspective, as to how we were able to support governments through that. And there's a variety of things, and again, many of them echoed back to the previous panel. So, yeah, we saw countries like Egypt able to move 22 million learners online in the space of 4 days. But we saw in the UK, both their central tax agency able to launch a furlough scheme to pay people who couldn't work within weeks, which would have normally taken months. We saw the welfare department able to deal with a 100% increase in claims of benefits because people couldn't work. In the US, we saw local governments able to expand their contact center capability because people couldn't go in offices anymore. So, and the underlying thing with a lot of these types of situations was that having a cloud type technology for their services meant that it could scale and could adapt very quickly compared to any sort of traditional type of technology they may have used before. Now, I don't want to go off the one about how fabulous cloud is, because I'm sure you don't want to hear that. But what's really important here is around governments getting a bit of a grasp about this and drawing that line between what they need to do for their citizens or businesses that they work with and how they can construct those digital services on the right sorts of technology that gives them that kind of flexibility. And I think we boiled it down to responsiveness as being the right word, because it can go beyond the context of the pandemic. And you can look at examples where it enables greater sharing of data. So we've seen local authorities in the UK use law enforcement and social services data to identify where social workers might be made vulnerable by going to a particular household, so they can use that data to actually join those data sets, which has always been traditionally difficult to do on physical tin and wires type of technology. So it comes down to some degree about having people in government who can understand what some of this technology can do, which is wonderful. But if they can't apply that as to how they build better services for their citizens, you risk getting into the technology for technology's sake type of world. So it's really drawing that line between what do people need from us as government bodies? How can we be more responsive to their needs, whether it's quite sophisticated use of data, being responsive to scale, or changing things quite quickly? And how do we then use modern technology to do that, to achieve a better outcome for the citizen in the first place?
Thank you, Mike. And I think that sort of alludes to also what I'm going to be asking Delphina in a second, is that how we use it and how we work with how governments work with external stakeholders to support what that technology can do and how it can support and override the challenges. I met very briefly with Delfina, and she's going now to tell us not all of them, because we don't have 4 hours again with some of these challenges that are being encountered. But Delfina, would you please share with us some examples of how the UN University is working on digital governance and challenges that you're encountering? I think it's probably going to be similar to what Mike's just also said about the different governmental departments. Over to you, Delfina.
Thank you so much. It's a very interesting question indeed, because since we started our activity, we have been increasing the number of projects of collaborations that we have with countries. And besides all the other activity that we conduct, more focused on research, etc., a lot of projects that we have currently are indeed with agencies that are implementing, that are responsible for the digital transformation of governments in different countries. And I'm also happy to share with you that most of those countries with which we have been working are from Africa. The region, as Vincenzo mentioned at the beginning, that has low scores in EGDI, the region that is lagging behind despite all the projects and even all the donors that are funding. And we know that this area of digital governance has been achieving a lot of attention by donors, and a lot of donors are putting money in developing this area in different countries. But despite of that, they are still lagging behind a lot. And what we realize is that indeed these kind of countries, they have huge needs, even if they have money to conduct, if a donor puts money to conduct some kind of project in this area, they need the support of someone to be able to do something. And most of them are still and currently trying to establish, to define their digital governance strategy. Most of them have a lot of different strategies, documents, roadmaps, and are now fighting with what should I do next? So they need to find some clarity, some guidance on how to define a digital governance strategy that is aligned with all the other initiatives that are running in the countries, or at the same time, and be able then to convert it in an action plan, in a set of projects, concrete projects that they can put in place. So this is one of the major requests that we receive from countries, and a lot of activity that we have been conducting is related to that. And another second difficulty that I think that is very common, I think is a great challenge. Is a great challenge for many years, and I believe that it will remain a big challenge, is related with the coordination, the governance of the digital governance. Let me use this expression. The coordination of all the digital transformation effort that the country is trying to conduct, independently of the country. We know that we have more mature, more advanced countries that have already some structures in place, but particularly for those countries that are not so mature, they don't have any structure in place, and it is very difficult for them to create some coordination mechanism that may help them and may ensure that the development is treated and looked at in a holistic way. Because we can't move, at least at the pace that we would like, if we don't have this articulation of all the efforts.
You were alluding to this, and we were saying this was a big core challenge, as you said. So I'd like to ask you all this question, starting with you, Delfina. As you mentioned, with this different levels of administration, it's very difficult to collaborate. You know, how can national and local levels of government work together better? You know, we may not have all the solutions, but how can they work better? and with other stakeholders. So I'm going to ask you, Delphina, and then to Anir, and then to Mike as an outside, a different stakeholder.
Yes, that's an issue indeed. That's an issue. As you know, we collaborated in the elaboration of the chapter 3 that is more focused on the assessment of digital government at the local level, and we realized that indeed there is this space of development of digital governance at the local level is completely different from the one that countries are doing at the national level. So things are not so well, are not so mature. And this may happen for many reasons. One of them is an issue, of course, of capacity. They don't have the capacity installed that is required to reply at the same level. But the other thing is the fact that there is indeed a big difficulty in create some kind of articulation of efforts between what is proposed, what is followed, what is developed at the national level, and what is happening at the local level. I can show you that. Yes.
Sorry, Delphina. Is there a way that you think they can work better?
It must be. We need to find it. One of the things why I think this is failing, I can suggest many arguments for that, but one of the reasons I think that is something very simple, is an issue of lack of communication. I think that some of the policies, guidelines, orientations, recommendations that a country develop at the national level, it may seem strange, but sometimes it does not reach the local level. If you question people that is working at the local level, if they heard, for instance, talk about some recommendation about some standards, about the existence of an interoperability platform that they could use to provide this service in a more integrated way, they reply, and I'm saying this because we conducted a study in Portugal, and the replies is, oh, I never heard about that. Others, oh, I don't think it is relevant. So I think that sometimes there are even simple issues that could improve a lot. Of course, there is always that point that is related with the autonomy that in some countries the local level has, that may hinder a bit this connection and this collaboration between.
I'm going to ask that question to Anir, you know, with all those great points that you've made about, you know, some of these challenges and what we can do better. Anir, what can we do better to make the national and local levels of government work collaboratively better and with our stakeholders?
Sammy, thank you. Very important question. I'll try to be not abstract, but concrete with 3 C's: coordination, capacity development, and citizens engagement. Now, they may sound like cliches, but let me go a little deeper. In terms of coordination, we felt that even though when we started about 15 years ago, we started with international consultants and development organizations developing digital strategy for us. And let me tell you that it did not work, because they were cut and paste from many developed countries and cut and paste from countries, even developing countries who have done well. But the context is very different. Every country has a very specific context. So you really have to develop a team which is politically, I think, empowered and bureaucratically embedded within the system. And that's what we had to do. We had to develop the team that I formed called A2I. It used to be called Access to Information. Now it's called Aspire to Innovate, soon to become the National Innovation Agency in the government. Started with the Prime Minister's office. Now it's embedded in Cabinet and ICT Ministry. So it's actually able to bring in the coordination across the board within the government. Also important is coordinating with the private sector. And we saw the possibilities, that the realm of possibilities during COVID for the first time. We talked about all sorts of coordination with private sector, which were not realized. But COVID made it so. And now that COVID is sort of going away, some of that possibilities I don't see happening anymore. But we saw the boundaries. Mike talked about how Amazon actually helped. During COVID, everybody helped. All NGOs in the country, all private sector actually helped quite a bit. So that's another coordination. That's one. Second is capacity within the government, including local government. So we introduced many different methodologies called service process simplification. And that's the mantra is simplify before digitization. So that was very, very helpful. We introduced something called Digital Service Design Lab. So series of these labs that were done over weeks to redesign a service from the perspective of citizens. We introduced something called empathy training, which is a design thinking that we trained about 35,000 civil servants on. So all these different things that actually came together, the technology frameworks, interoperability, they actually were driven through bureaucracy, not through technology companies. The third is citizens' engagement. And this is where I think really looking through the eyes of the citizen, listening to them. I think the previous panel actually harped on that quite a bit. We see three things that needs to happen there with citizens' engagement. One is that digital inequality has to be seen through the eyes of individuals, persons with disabilities, women, elderly, indigenous population. And we have to understand that just making digital resources available to them is not enough. You have to work with them and see that they are making the best use of this digital resource and design them in their way. Second is we have to think very holistically. And there is something that we're looking at now that we have never done before is the issue of power asymmetry and information asymmetry within society. So the power structure within the socioeconomic realm of a society really defines how digitization is used and vice versa. And digitization also affects the power asymmetry within society. And the third thing that we're looking at is something that we have seen in Professor Amartya Sen's literature. It's called adverse digital incorporation. Some digitization is actually harmful. So we can't say that all digitization leads to great benefits for everybody. So we really need to be very nuanced in our design, in our implementation, in our engagement with citizens. And that's where we need to look at what digitization harms and what digitization helps and make that distinction and not do the ones that are harming right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Anir. That's absolutely crucial. And I love things in threes because it helps us all retain that. Before we go out to our audience, because I can see there's a lot of questions coming in and they're being voted. Mike, lastly, that question to you, national and local levels of government working together better with stakeholders like AWS.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one because in my own experience in the UK government, we treated the two things quite separately and almost got quite sort of verticalised around the Whitehall government, which is the sort of central federal government in the UK, and the healthcare sector is quite separate and local government is quite separate as well. And we put a lot of our efforts initially in the UK into dealing with the big offices of state and how they could be digitized and used all the good ingredients that the other panelists talk about being user-centric, about having digital inclusion, all those sorts of things. The political structure in the UK around local government is very, very devolved. So central government doesn't tell local government what to do in the UK. And that very much varies from country to country, to region. So I think one of the first things you have to understand is the relationship between central and local government is not a consistent thing, and people have different 2-tier, 3-tier systems and things like that. So you need to be mindful of how all those different sort of things glue together and how they work, and not try and take something that works great from a central government perspective and try and implement it at a local government level, because they have different constraints. And again, what I've learned from working chiefly in the UK is that the way that local government organisations like to implement things is much more in a gradual way, because they don't have the bandwidth or the budget for large-scale transformation programs. So they need kind of bite-sized chunks that they can consume, change, get the value within the organisation, then move on to the next one. So they need different kind of models of implementation as well. But I think the final thing where central government can really help local government, though, is to bring what I call platform economics to bear on it. So if you take an example, the UK has 400 local government bodies up and down the country who have a similar set of statutory obligations that they provide for citizens, and they provide many citizen and business services themselves. So if there are opportunities where central government can provide seed funding to build a platform that could be used across a cohort of those organisations, and they do it in such a way that enables essentially the local government organisations to get that service for free, that's where they can really help them. Because I think what underpins all of this for me, and this is where I think technology is really helpful, that the less money you can spend on software licenses and upgrades and all that type of stuff, the more money you can spend on face-to-face social workers and school places and things like that, is where you can really make a difference and really use technology to drive better services out locally. But I think, again, a bit back to Ania's point, it's always dangerous to cut and paste something from one place to another. So understanding the difference between local and central government is important, but understanding where you can leverage the power of central government and use kind of platform scale thinking to enable the local people to do what they do really well at the front line and give them the tools to do it in a nice commoditized way.
Throw away the cookie cutter is what we're saying ultimately with that. Thank you, Mike. We have got so many questions. We're not going to get through all of them. I'll try and get through as many as we can, 2 or 3 at least, before I come and ask you all one final big question, because I always like to leave the big question for you at the end. And I'm going to reach out to whoever would like to answer this one first. So please do throw your hands up. It's good to see hands and physicality. We've had a question upvoted. In poorer countries, the majority of people are and can still be illiterate. The infrastructure is non-existent. Do you think it's too early to talk about digitalization in those regions? Who would like to? It's a big question there. Delphina, I'm looking at you. Yes, I saw that hand going up. I knew it would come up.
I don't know. I don't think that it is too early to talk about digitalization. But when approaching and when thinking about how to conduct this digitalization, again, as Ani said, we need to look at the context. We can't start to think about certain solutions, certain ideas that we are already applying in countries that are already advanced, let me say this way, in digital governance. But it is important that we start to think, because if we start to think even at the same time that we are strengthening the connection, the infrastructures, if we are already thinking about how to digitalize, how to make governments operate in a digitalized way, maybe we can avoid certain steps that we had to do in situations where we had a legacy. For instance, in some of these countries, there is not even a legacy systems. So if we start to think this issue of digitalization framed and aligned with the context that we have, and at the same time we are investing in infrastructures, maybe we'll be able to avoid certain steps and certain issues that we had to went through in other countries.
Ania.
As Delphina said, I think it's really about context. When we started in Bangladesh, we had less than 1% internet penetration. And we said that we'll become a digital country. So what that meant is that we needed to set up centers in local government offices, all rural local government offices, 4,500 of them. We set up centers where people would come, pay a small fee, and access digital services through the entrepreneurs. They won't access them directly. So this we call indirect digital literacy. So they're not digital literate directly. So if we actually say, what is the digital literacy of Bangladesh? We will say, even now, 45% smartphone penetration, 65% internet penetration. It doesn't work all the time. We have internet, but doesn't work all the time. but people are accessing digital services through these 4,500 centers in local government offices and another 4,500 in private sector. So there is this very deep private-public partnership that has really happened. So we need to look at that through that. These centers were all closed during COVID. So what do? Then we repurposed our national helpline so that people could call into that helpline using feature phones, 333, and can ask for telemedicine service, can ask for emergency food support, can ask for land records through that. So new things came up. Again, use old technology, use physical as a blend with digital. So we can't say that it has to be like Estonia or like UK or like US. And everybody will actually operate digital services on the web using their smart devices. That's not going to happen, but we can make it contextual and design it right.
Back to your 3 C's. Thank you, Ania. I want to ask this is a very big question with not a huge amount of time left, but it has been voted up. And this is the core of everything we're talking about. How can we adapt the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals with digital services in the context of the Global South? It ties in to my final question to you all. So if we can try and keep it concise with 4 minutes left, what one thing would you highlight from your experience that can be done to help developing countries? And again, we can highlight the Global South, but let's be a little broader as well, to overcome their special challenges and achieve this SDGs within this context. It's a big question to ask you all to answer in 30 to 60 seconds, but I'm going to try, and I'm going to start with you, Mike.
Thank you. So I think my simple answer would be, don't keep recreating things that other people have already created, or don't keep trying to solve problems other people have already solved. And in our organisation, we have a firm belief that governments should collaborate, not compete. So anything that you can do to learn from, borrow from, using open source, open standard solutions, so that governments can actually reuse things that they've created, or the expertise or whatever, means that a lot of energy doesn't go into doing things that have already been solved. Which means that then that energy can go into some of those more unique local problems that different countries face, depending on their own economics, geography, population, whatever it is that drives them out. But how to send payments around has kind of been solved a few times. So don't go and invest millions on building a payment system.
Do not reinvent the wheel, collaborate,
Yes.
not compete. Delphina, very short answer, one thing that can be done to support developing countries.
Work with them, understand that they have huge needs and work with them very honestly, and particularly because they are extremely dependent on donors, try to bring all the donors together. This is something that I've been witnessing. Sometimes we have donors funding things that are all the same thing being funded by different donors, what does not make sense at all, just create confusion, or funding things that are in a way incompatible, not compatible, if you want. So I think that try to contribute to this coordination, articulation of donors, of entities, and to advise them to enter in partnerships.
Perfect, bring those donors together. Ania, final one very quick highlight from your experience. I know you've given us lots of them, but one more, please.
Sure. I think South-South cooperation is going to be key, because Southern countries understand problems of other Southern countries. And we formed this South-South Network for Public Service Innovation about 5 years ago with the UN Office for South-South Cooperation. Now it has about 30 countries as members and about 13 international organizations of 43 members. And they're working really well in terms of sharing best practices and helping each other out. But I'll add a 1.B, if you allow, and that's public-private partnership as well. I think private sector has so much knowledge, experience, and data that we saw being really put to good use during COVID. If we can keep that ethos going forward, that will also really help. Thank you.
It was worth having the 1B. Thank you, Ania. Great closing words. Thank you to our panelists for a great discussion and sharing your insights and expertise. And grateful thanks to you, the audience, for your challenging and really interesting questions. As we draw to the close here, for those of you watching on Zoom, you're going to see an exit survey pop up when you leave the meeting. Please do just spare a couple of minutes. We're closing on time. We'd really love you to fill that in because we'd love to hear your feedback. UN DESA will be back with another global policy dialogue in October related to population growth in anticipation of the world reaching 8 billion people in a few weeks' time. I will see you there. You can bookmark this on un.org/DESA for details on that event. You can also check out on the DESA website the new e-government survey. You've got that link. Enjoy the read and see how your country ranks with regards to its digital services. Finally, just one more time to all of our panelists joining us today, I'd like to say a big thank you, and of course, a thank you to our organisers, UN DESA, and I wish you all a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Sami, for the brilliant moderation and to